The world had shrunk to the insistent thrum of the boat engine and the shifting, impenetrable gray of the fog. Dean watched the churning water, a relentless monochrome that mirrored the landscape of his mind. He gripped the worn canvas duffel beside him, his knuckles white. Solitude was a balm he craved, a necessary amputation. But this journey felt less like an escape and more like a descent. The last 6 months had been a slow, agonizing erosion, leaving behind a hollowed-out shape where a man once stood. He needed to rebuild, brick by agonizing brick, and this desolate island, his estranged grandfather's inheritance, was to be his quarry. A fresh start, he'd told the solicitor, though the words felt like ashes in his mouth. The boat, a sturdy, salt-battered vessel operated by a taciturn fisherman, cut through the dense vapor. The air grew colder, damp, carrying the sharp tang of brine and something else. Something ancient and vegetal, like decaying kelp and forgotten stone. Dean shivered, pulling his wool jacket tighter. He hadn't seen a soul since leaving the mainland's small, windswept port hours ago. Just the endless gray and the occasional cry of a gannet, muffled by the mist. The island. As they drew closer, the fisherman cut the engine, allowing the boat to drift towards a small, barnacle-encrusted jetty. Dean scanned the coastline, his cartographer's eye naturally seeking out landmarks, patterns. A remote monastery. The fisherman had grunted when Dean pointed. It looked older than the island itself, a silent sentinel brooding over the treacherous shores. Its presence, stark and austere, sent a prickle of unease down Dean's spine. He disembarked, the wooden planks of the jetty groaning under his weight. The air here was heavy, thick with moisture, and the scent of decay was stronger, mixed now with the metallic tang of salt-rusted iron. The fisherman, without a word, began unloading Dean's meager belongings. A trunk of old maps, a box of drawing instruments, a rucksack of clothes, and a crate of non-perishable food. The tracks, the fisherman finally rasped, pointing a calloused finger towards a faint, overgrown path that snaked up the incline. Follow them. Leads to the light. Dean nodded, his throat tight. He paid the man, who merely grunted again before turning the boat, the engine sputtering back to life, the vessel quickly swallowed by the fog. Dean was alone. Truly alone. The path was treacherous, slick with moss and loose stones. He pushed through tangled brambles and gnarled, stunted trees, their branches clawing at the thick air. The island felt ancient, untamed, as if humanity had merely scratched a temporary mark upon its primeval hide. He kept moving, his gaze fixed on the ascent, a determined but weary ache settling in his chest. Finally, the path opened onto a windswept plateau. There it stood. Beside it, the keeper's cottage, a low-slung stone structure, looked as if it had grown organically from the rock face. The paint on the front door, once white, had peeled away in leprous flakes, revealing the raw, weathered wood beneath. A broken fence leaned drunkenly, swallowed by encroaching weeds. He approached the cottage, the crunch of his boots on the gravel path the only sound. The air here was still, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else. A faint, earthy odor like wet clay and stagnant water that seemed to cling to the very stones of the house. He found the key beneath a loose flagstone, just as the solicitor had instructed. The lock groaned in protest, a drawn-out metallic shriek that seemed to echo across the desolate landscape. He pushed the door open, and a gust of stale, frigid air rushed out to meet him. Sunlight, what little there was, struggled through grime-streaked windows, casting weak, elongated patterns on the floor. He stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The silence was profound, yet not empty. He stood there, breathing in the scent of abandonment, the peculiar earthy smell now stronger, almost cloying. Dean froze, his head cocked, listening. It was just the wind, he told himself, but the sound had been too distinct, too close. He blinked, but it was gone, swallowed by the gloom. He was tired, he reasoned, the journey and his grief playing tricks on his mind. He moved deeper into the cottage, his hand trailing along a dusty bookshelf. But even as he tried to focus on the mundane task, a profound sense of isolation began to settle over him, heavy and suffocating. This was more than just a remote island. It felt like a place forgotten by time, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, and something ancient stirred just beneath the surface of perception. The wind, though not strong, carried a peculiar chill that seeped into Dean's bones, sharper than the sea spray. It tasted not of salt alone, but of something metallic, an almost ferrous tang that made his tongue prickle. The path, barely a goat track, clung to the island's craggy spine, slick with emerald moss and loose, shale-like stones that skittered under his boots. Every few steps, his foot would slide, sending a jolt of alarm through him. The fog, a dense, wet shroud, pressed in from all sides, muting the world to a uniform gray, swallowing the distant roar of the surf and muffling even his own ragged breaths. He could see no more than a few feet ahead, each step an act of faith into the unknown. He kept one hand on the rough, cold rock face to his right, feeling the damp, abrasive texture beneath his fingers. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decaying seaweed, but also something else, something earthy and damp, like disturbed soil after a long rain. As he climbed, the wind seemed to pick up, not in force, but in its quality. It began to carry an echo, a faint, drawn-out hum that seemed to resonate deep within his chest, a sound so low it was almost felt rather than heard. It wasn't a human voice, yet it possessed a strange, resonant quality, like distant chimes struggling against a gale, or a mournful, sustained note played on some vast, unseen instrument. Dean shook his head, blaming the isolation, the fatigue, the residual grief that still clung to him like a second skin. It was just the wind, whistling through crevices, playing tricks on his mind. After what felt like an eternity, the path leveled, then dipped. Through a momentary thinning in the mist, a silhouette emerged. The lighthouse keeper's cottage. Squat, gray, and defiant, it hunched against the elements, its single, unblinking eye of glass staring blankly into the fog. No light shone from its lantern, no welcoming glow from its windows. It looked less like a home and more like a tombstone marking the island's desolate heart. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light that pierced the grimy windows. Dean dropped his duffel bag in the main room, his gaze sweeping over the sparse furnishings. A rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot draped with a moth-eaten blanket. His grandfather had lived a Spartan existence. He walked to the window, wiping a patch of condensation with his sleeve. The fog had thinned slightly here, revealing the rocky shoreline. And then he saw it. The tide. It was receding with unnatural speed, pulling back from the rocks far beyond where it should have been. It looked as if the sea itself was holding its breath, drawing back in preparation for something. Dean frowned. He was a cartographer. He understood coastal dynamics. This wasn't right. Not for this time of year, not with the gentle swell he'd observed on the journey over. They seemed to rise and fall with the wind, weaving in and out of the cottage's ancient timbers. It was impossible to discern words, only the suggestion of them, a low, guttural murmur that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. He gripped the lamp's cold metal. "Just the wind," he muttered aloud, the sound of his own voice thin and unconvincing in the echoing silence. Just the old house groaning. He decided to explore, to occupy his mind. His grandfather had kept a study, a small room off the main living area cluttered with maps, navigational instruments, and stacks of yellowed books. On a heavy, salt-stained desk beneath a haphazard pile of charts, Dean's fingers brushed against something leather-bound and stiff. The pages, thick and brittle, smelled strongly of the sea and something else. A faint, earthy aroma that reminded him of the strange tang on the wind. He opened it carefully. The handwriting was his grandfather's, precise yet spidery, filling page after page with observations of the weather, ship movements, and the relentless, monotonous log of the lighthouse. But interspersed amongst these routine entries were things that made Dean's breath catch. Crude, unsettling sketches. And then the words. Not just the log entries, but rambling, desperate warnings. The tides are wrong, always wrong. They sing, in the deep song. The phrase appeared again and again, scrawled with increasing urgency. It calls to me. And then, a series of entries that made his blood feel like ice in his veins. Descriptions of the monastery. The old pact, kept at the remote monastery. They know. They listen. There was a rough map, too, sketched on a torn page, showing a path leading away from the lighthouse, inland, towards a small, crudely drawn building marked with a cross. The monastery, the caption read, almost illegible. Dean slammed the journal shut, the sound echoing sharply in the small room. His heart hammered against his ribs. His grandfather had been isolated for years. He'd lost his mind, perhaps. He was seen things. Imagined things. The sea, the solitude. It could do that to a man. Dean, the rational cartographer, tried to force his thoughts into orderly lines. Hallucinations, delusions, the ravings of a man driven mad by the elements. Dean's fingers, tentative and cool, brushed against a small, leather-bound volume tucked beneath a stack of brittle nautical charts. It was not a book, not really, but a journal. Its cover, once a rich, dark hide, was now stiff with salt and age, mottled with what looked like dried algae. He pulled it free, the paper beneath it crackling like old bones. The pages were thick, rough, filled with his grandfather's spidery, precise script, often bleeding slightly from the damp. The study was a repository of a life lived on the edge of the world, a labyrinth of maritime lore and personal obsession. Maps, hand-drawn and printed, covered every available surface, many marked with peculiar symbols Dean couldn't immediately decipher, circles with radiating lines, triangles pointing downwards, annotations in a language that looked almost runic. He opened the journal. The initial entries were mundane, observations on weather patterns, lighthouse maintenance, supply runs. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more frantic, the margins filled with sketches of impossible geometries and strange, undulating forms. Dean felt a prickle of unease. He recognized some of the recurring terms now. Yahanthle, the deep ones, the black stone. Nonsense, he told himself. But the consistency of the references, the increasingly desperate tone, gnawed at him. He spent the rest of the afternoon poring over the journal and the scattered documents in the study. He found faded newspaper clippings detailing local disappearances from decades past, dismissed as accidents at sea. He uncovered a brittle, hand-copied fragment of what appeared to be an ancient island history, speaking of a sunken city off the coast. Sacrifices made to appease the hunger beneath the waves. A shiver traced its way down Dean's spine. His grandfather hadn't just been a keeper of the light. He had been a keeper of secrets. The journal entries became clearer, or perhaps Dean was simply becoming accustomed to his grandfather's increasingly erratic hand. Phrases jumped out at him. The pact made, the offering given, the bargain struck. His grandfather wrote of a generational duty, a terrible agreement with something ancient and patient, a presence that granted the islanders prosperity in exchange for something else. The details were maddeningly vague, shrouded in metaphor and fear, but the implication was clear. A price was paid, and the entity beneath the waves was a part of it. This wasn't just folklore. His grandfather had believed it. The only sounds were the persistent groan of the foghorn, a mournful lament, and the relentless sigh of the ocean. He tried to rationalize it all, the ramblings of an old man, perhaps driven mad by solitude and the relentless sea. The specific details, the recurring motifs across disparate documents, painted a picture too consistent to be mere delusion. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Dean's dreams were vivid, disturbing tapestries woven from the day's discoveries. He was underwater, not drowning, but sinking, the pressure building around him, crushing the air from his lungs without pain, only a profound, suffocating sense of presence. He felt eyes upon him, not seeing, but knowing. He felt himself being pulled, drawn inexorably towards its depths, a terrifying gravity that promised oblivion. He swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet meeting the rough wood of the floorboards. As his eyes adjusted to the dim pre-dawn light filtering through the window, Dean noticed it. A faint, ethereal glow emanating from the corner of the room, near the old cast-iron stove. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat. Clinging to the rough-hewn timber of the wall, spreading in intricate branching patterns, was a luminous growth. It pulsed with a soft phosphorescent light, a sickly blue-green that seemed to throb in time with some unseen rhythm. It looked like algae, but unlike any he had ever seen, and it was growing inside his home, far from any natural water source. It felt alive, yet utterly alien. This was no dream, no hallucination. This was real. His grandfather's frantic scrawls, the legends of the sunken city, the terrifying dreams, they were all converging, solidifying into a horrifying truth. The pact wasn't just history. It was a living, breathing threat. He remembered a recurring note in his grandfather's later entries, a reference to an ancient archive, a place where the island's true history was supposedly kept. It was a remote monastery, high on the island's windswept northern cliffs, a place his grandfather had visited with increasing frequency. It was his only lead, his desperate hope. He pulled it free, the ancient paper whispering a dry protest. He settled back into the rickety chair, the journal heavy in his lap. The first few pages were neat, standard entries about weather and lighthouse maintenance, but then the script began to change. It grew more frantic, the ink bleeding in places as if the writer's hand had trembled. Dean leaned closer, deciphering the spidery scrawl. Day 147. Not the wind, not the gulls. Something else. From the deep. He flipped a few pages, his eyes scanning for keywords, for anything that made sense of his grandfather's descent. Day 201. The pact. It demands. The old tales from the remote monastery. They spoke of such things. Dean must find the symbols, the wards. It hungers. A remote monastery. Dean pictured it, a desolate stone structure clinging to a distant, craggy shore, perhaps similar in its isolation to his own cottage. What knowledge could his grandfather have sought there? As he absorbed the words, a low thrum began. It was faint at first, barely perceptible. A vibration in the floorboards beneath his feet, a tremor in the very air. He dismissed it as the old house settling, or perhaps the distant chug of a fishing boat. But it didn't fade. Instead, it subtly intensified, a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in his own chest, a deep, hypnotic frequency that was both unsettling and strangely compelling. He turned another page. Beneath it, his grandfather had scrawled, "The ward, from the monastery. It holds for now, but it demands more. An offering, to appease the hunger. An offering." The word hung in the air, heavy and disturbing. What could his grandfather have offered? Dean's gaze drifted to the small, ornate compass on the desk. As he watched, the compass, without a breath of wind or a tremor of the old table, slowly, deliberately, spun a quarter turn on its own axis, then settled. He blinked, convinced his eyes had played a trick. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool brass, and nudged it back into place. The hum grew. He resisted, forcing his attention back to the journal. Day 289. The dreams are vivid. The deep calls to me. I see its forms, shifting, fluid. It seeks passage. The ward weakens. The island feels porous. I must try the ritual, the one from the texts. It is my only hope. For the island. For myself. Dean swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Rituals? What kind of rituals? He thought of the strange, dried stains on the floorboards, the peculiar arrangement of stones in the cellar. He had attributed them to his grandfather's eccentricity. But now, he stood abruptly, the journal clattering to the floor. The hum surged, a wave of sound that seemed to press in on his eardrums, vibrating behind his eyes. He walked towards the small, tarnished mirror hanging by the door, intending to splash cold water on his face. As he approached, his own reflection stared back, pale and drawn. But then, it shifted. Not his face, not the lines of fatigue, but something behind him, in the reflection. A ripple, like water disturbed, passed through the mirrored surface. His eyes widened. For a split second, his reflection distorted, his features elongating, blurring, melting into something indistinct, something wet. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back, his own terrified face staring out at him, perfectly normal. Dean gasped, stumbling back, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drum against the insistent hum. He stared at the mirror, but it showed only the dusty room, the journal on the floor, the empty space behind him. He squeezed his eyes shut, then opened them again. It was gone. A hallucination. A trick of the light, brought on by exhaustion and the unsettling words of the journal. A low scraping sound echoed from the far corner of the room, near the heavy wooden chest his grandfather had kept. Dean whipped his head around. He stared, frozen. The hum intensified, a deep, resonant chord that seemed to emanate from the very walls, from the floor, from the air itself. It pulled at him, a physical tug towards the window, towards the restless sea. He took a hesitant step, then another, drawn by an invisible current. Beyond it, the fog had thickened, pressing against the glass like a shroud. And then he saw it. In the swirling gray, just beyond the glass, a form began to coalesce. It was like a column of churning water, yet it held a terrifying, almost intelligent outline. Vaguely humanoid, but impossibly vast, impossibly ancient. A faint, briny scent, like stagnant tide pools and something rotten, filled his nostrils. He couldn't scream, couldn't move. The form solidified further, its surface shimmering with an unholy light, like phosphorescence from the deepest trench. It was close, impossibly close. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it dissolved. Dean stumbled back, collapsing against the wall, his legs giving out. His lungs burned, starved for air. He pressed his palms against his eyes, trying to erase the image, the impossible, terrifying vision. The hum, though quieter now, was still there. A constant, insidious presence, vibrating deep within him. He stared into the tarnished glass of the mirror, his reflection a pale, gaunt stranger with wide, bloodshot eyes. He reached for the basin, his hand shaking, intending to splash cold water onto his face. But the image in the mirror rippled. Not the glass, but his own face. It elongated, the skin stretching taut over sharp angles, his eyes sinking into shadowed hollows. A faint sheen of green seemed to flicker across his pupils, like light refracting through murky water. He recoiled, gasping, the cold ceramic of the basin jarring against his fingertips. It was just his mind playing tricks, a phantom echo of the journal's unsettling revelations. He clenched his fists, forcing the tremors from his limbs. No, he wouldn't succumb. Not yet. He turned from the distorted image, the hum receding slightly, leaving a phantom pressure behind his ears. He had to understand. He needed to understand. His grandfather's erratic scrawl seemed to swim before his eyes. But Dean forced his gaze to focus, tracing the lines of ink with grim resolve. The entries grew less observational, more confessional, tinged with a desperate urgency. His grandfather hadn't merely documented the anomaly, he had actively engaged with it, seeking to contain it. There were references to ancient texts, to symbols that Dean recognized from the crude sketches on the cottage walls, symbols he'd dismissed as abstract doodles until now. The barrier weakens. The deep song, it calls to me, promising oblivion, promising knowledge beyond human ken. I must reinforce the wardings, the old ways, the forgotten rites. I journeyed to the remote monastery, seeking the texts, the true incantations passed down through generations of watchers. The reclusive keeper, his eyes like polished obsidian, understood. He gave me the scrolls, not in charity, but in grim recognition of the coming tide. Said they were the last bulwark. The salt circle must be renewed with the moon's full cycle. The offerings, they demand blood, not of man, but of the creatures of the shore. Offerings? Blood? His grandfather, the stoic, quiet man he barely remembered, involved in arcane rituals? It was madness. The deep song wasn't just a metaphor for the entity's influence. It was a tangible, auditory assault. As Dean read, the low hum began to swell again. Not from the journal this time, but from everywhere at once. It pressed against his eardrums, vibrated through the wooden floorboards, seeped into the very air. He blinked, and for a fleeting moment, the rough-hewn stone walls of the cottage seemed to undulate, like kelp swaying in a slow current. Just the journal. He opened his eyes, determined to finish. The world solidified, but the edges felt softer, less defined. Another entry, scrawled in a frantic hand, detailed the precise measurements for a containment chamber. The lowest point, beneath the lantern room, beneath the living quarters. The stone must be solid, the seals absolute. It is the core of the pact, the true resting place. Should the entity awaken fully, this chamber, consecrated by the words of the monastery scrolls, will be its temporary prison. The light above, a beacon against the gloom, the warding below, a cage for the unspeakable. The key, hidden in plain sight, for only one who truly understands the weight of the burden. Dean's gaze darted around the small, cramped space. Lowest point, beneath the lantern room, beneath the living quarters. That meant directly below where he stood. A hidden chamber, a crypt. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat trying to drown out the deep song. He was losing his grip. He knew it. But a strange, defiant spark ignited within him. He wouldn't let it claim him. Not before he understood. He moved slowly, deliberately, towards the center of the cottage, his eyes sweeping across the aged floorboards. He ran his hand along the rough wood, feeling for any inconsistency, any seam that didn't quite fit. He moved towards the far wall, near the narrow, winding staircase that led up to the lantern room. There was a faint give, a subtle difference in texture. He pressed harder. He knelt, his knees protesting, and peered closer. A thin, almost invisible line traced the outline of a square section of the floorboards, expertly fitted. A tiny, rusted iron ring, almost flush with the wood, was the only indication. It was the key, hidden in plain sight. With a grunt of effort, Dean hooked his fingers into the ring and pulled. The wood groaned, protesting, but slowly, grudgingly, the section lifted, revealing a gaping black maw beneath. The deep song swelled, a triumphant roar in his mind, as if the entity itself was acknowledging his discovery. A crypt. And he, Dean, stood at its precipice. He saw a faint, almost imperceptible seam in the rough-hewn stone floor, barely visible beneath a layer of salt-caked grime and dust. It wasn't a trapdoor, not in the conventional sense, but a section of the floor that seemed to shift, to subtly not belong. The hum, no longer just a sound, vibrated through his bones, a low, resonant frequency that made his teeth ache. Dean dropped to his knees, scraping away centuries of accumulated grit with frantic fingers. Beneath the dust, the seam widened slightly, revealing a thin, dark line. There were no hinges, no obvious handle. He ran his hands along the cold, damp stone, searching. He pressed. Nothing. The hum intensified, throbbing now, a physical presence in the air. He leaned his full weight onto the indentation, a silent prayer escaping his lips. It descended slowly, painstakingly, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic shaft leading into absolute blackness. A gust of air, heavy and rank with the scent of stagnant water, decay, and something unidentifiable, something metallic and sweet, like old blood and brine assaulted him. He recoiled, gagging, but the morbid curiosity, the desperate need to understand, pulled him forward. The hum was deafening here, a roar that clawed at his sanity, vibrating inside his skull. It wasn't just sound. It was pressure, a distortion of reality. He fumbled for his lantern, its beam cutting a weak swathe through the impenetrable gloom. The shaft descended steeply, a winding, uneven staircase carved directly into the living rock. This is it, the end of the line, the truth. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to run, to seal the opening and pretend he'd never seen it. The walls of the shaft were rough, damp, adorned with strange, angular carvings that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. They weren't symbols he recognized, but intricate, interlocking patterns that defied logic, like a nightmare geometry etched into stone. The staircase opened into a small, circular chamber, barely large enough for him to stand upright. The air here was thick, suffocating, a miasma of ancient smells. The hum resonated from the very heart of the space, a focal point of unimaginable power. It wasn't an artifact he could comprehend, not truly. It was a pulsating mass, a living, breathing paradox. It pulsed, contracting and expanding with a slow, deliberate rhythm, each beat sending a wave of visceral vibration through the chamber. Around the chamber's perimeter, etched into the stone walls, were more carvings. These were different, more pictorial. They depicted robed figures, their faces obscured by deep hoods, engaged in what looked like ritualistic veneration. They knelt before a similar pulsating mass, their arms outstretched. Above them, an inscription in a language Dean couldn't decipher, but beneath it, crudely carved, almost an afterthought, were familiar words. From the remote monastery, the watchers kept vigil. The monastery. They weren't just observers. They were guardians, or perhaps facilitators. This chamber, this thing, was a nexus, a tether. The rhythmic thrum intensified, becoming a frantic, overwhelming beat. He was no longer in the lighthouse, no longer on the island. Before him, the pulsating mass swelled, growing to an impossible size, encompassing his entire field of vision. He saw the island, not as he knew it, but as a skeletal ruin. Its cliffs eroded into crumbling dust, its lighthouse a broken finger pointing at a sky choked with a crimson haze. Then the vision shifted, sharpened. He saw himself, or a grotesque parody of himself, standing on the island's shore. He was a vessel, a puppet, his form distended and twisted, his mouth open in a silent, unending scream. The entity wasn't just awakening, it was consuming. It wasn't just encroaching, it was assimilating. The island Dean, everything was merely sustenance, a pathway for its ultimate emergence, a new form of reality it intended to impose. The vision snapped back, the chamber reforming around him, the pulsating mass shrinking to its original size, though its thrumming still echoed in the raw, screaming chambers of his mind. The air felt thin, sharp, like shards of ice. The pact wasn't forgotten. It was merely waiting to be fulfilled. And Dean, the reclusive cartographer, was the key. The air around the pulsating mass in the chamber began to distort, shimmering like heat haze over a summer road. But this was a chill distortion, a rippling of reality itself. Dean felt it before he saw it clearly. A sudden, crushing pressure in his chest, as if the very atmosphere had thickened, becoming viscous and heavy. He clamped his hands over his temples, a futile gesture against the invasive sound. He watched, horrified, as the shimmering coalesced, not into heat, but into visible currents of something formless and vast. It was like staring at the ocean through a fractured pane of glass, except the ocean was inside the remote monastery pressing in. Vague, colossal shapes began to emerge within the distortion, dark against the already dim stone, undulating with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tendrils, he thought, or perhaps just extensions of an impossible anatomy, pressing against an unseen barrier that separated this dimension from his own. He gasped, a dry, rattling sound in his throat. It wasn't just observing him. It was reaching. It was a hunger, vast and ancient, a desire to consume, to integrate. Dean stumbled back, scrambling away from the edge of the pit, his heart hammering against his ribs with a frantic, desperate rhythm. This wasn't just a discovery. It was an invasion. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him breathless and reeling. He was trapped, not just in this remote monastery, but in the crosshairs of something profoundly malevolent. What? He didn't know. He only knew he couldn't stay in this chamber. The air grew heavier, the pressure building, and he could almost taste the salt and decay that clung to the fringes of the entity's presence. He turned, his movements clumsy, his legs feeling like lead, and stumbled back through the labyrinthine corridors. The cold stone walls offered no comfort, only a stark, echoing silence that amplified the internal clamor of his fear. He reached the small, dusty study where he had first found the journal. It felt like a lifetime ago. He snatched the thick, leather-bound book from the desk, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. This was his only hope, his only weapon. His grandfather, for all his cryptic warnings, had left something behind, some fragment of understanding, some defense. Dean threw himself into the heavy wooden chair, the springs groaning under his weight, and frantically began flipping through the journal's brittle pages. He scanned for keywords: binding, seal, repel, ward. His eyes darted across the pages, each line a jumble of half-forgotten lore, astrological symbols, and strange, archaic diagrams. He could still feel the distant thrumming, a low, guttural vibration that seeped through the thick stone walls, a constant reminder of the encroaching horror in the chamber below. Please. More urgent hand. His grandfather's, he was sure. It spoke of cycles, of the veil between worlds thinning, of ancient debts. The text was fragmented, interspersed with sketches of swirling currents and distorted figures. The anchor must be bound, not by blood alone, but by a deeper severance. The pact demands repayment. To close the gate, one must offer to that which holds the truest measure of self. The bond must be broken, the tether cut, and the cost, the ultimate forfeit. Dean's breath hitched. A life for a life? It was personal. Deeply, irrevocably personal. Was that the tether? To truly let go, to sever the last emotional link to his past? His hands clenched, crumpling the delicate page. The cost, the ultimate forfeit. It wasn't just his own life it might demand, but the very essence of what made him. Him. To seal the portal, to sever the entity's connection to this plane, he would have to make a terrible, unimaginable sacrifice. The journal offered no easy answers, only a path paved with profound loss. He stared at the page, the symbols swirling, threatening to pull him deeper into a madness he feared he could not escape. It wasn't just a life, not merely a soul. It was a piece of him, a part so intimately woven into his being that its loss would unravel him entirely. He thought of the gaping void left by his own profound tragedy, the phantom weight of what he'd lost. Could the entity demand that? The very capacity for memory, for grief, for love? The thought was a cold, alien hand pressing against his heart, threatening to crush it. Outside, the island had begun to scream. The fog, a constant companion, had thickened into an opaque, churning wall, pressing against the lighthouse glass with a palpable weight. It was no longer merely moisture, but a living, suffocating shroud. Through its swirling depths, Dean could discern distorted shapes trees bent into grotesque parodies of themselves, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. The sea, usually a symphony of crashing waves, had become a cacophony of guttural roars and wet, sloshing sighs. He watched from the lantern room as colossal waves, black and oily, slammed against the cliffs, sending geysers of spray that seemed to hang in the air, reluctant to fall. It was a sound that spoke of unimaginable size, of ancient, uncoiling power. It urged him to surrender, promised oblivion, an end to the gnawing grief that had been his constant companion. No, not yet. He wouldn't yield. He couldn't. His grandfather, in his final desperate entries, had detailed the counter-ritual. It wasn't a simple incantation. He traced the faded, intricate drawing on the page a crude map, really, indicating a winding path through the gnarled, salt-blasted trees, ending at a crumbling structure partially swallowed by the encroaching cliffs. The symbol for the entity was scrawled next to it, trapped within a protective circle. This was the locus, the weak point. It wasn't his life, not directly. It was the memory. The specific memory that defined his profound tragedy, the one he clung to, the one that gave his suffering its shape. To sever that, to offer it, would be to erase the very essence of his love, his loss. His breath hitched, a ragged sound in the storm's fury. To forget, to truly forget. But the alternative was the island consumed, then the world. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from below, followed by the screech of grinding stone. He looked down through the lantern room's floor hatch. The spiraling staircase, usually solid and reassuring, now seemed to writhe in the flickering light. Tendrils of black, slick seaweed, unnaturally thick and pulsating, had begun to snake up from the ground floor, adhering to the stone, secreting a foul, briny odor. The lighthouse itself was being slowly digested. Now, the seaweed pulsed, mimicking the thrumming beneath the island. He gathered the few items his grandfather's journal specified for the ritual: a heavy brass censer, a small vial of dried, local herbs, a chunk of black volcanic rock from the island's highest peak, and, most crucially, a tarnished silver locket, his grandfather's. He realized, still warm from being in the journal, his own offering would be less tangible, but infinitely more precious. He strapped a small canvas bag across his chest, the weight of its contents a grim comfort. The wind howled outside, a banshee's shriek that tore at the very fabric of reality. He pulled on his thickest oilskins, the rough fabric scratching against his skin. As he unbarred the heavy wooden door, the storm slammed into him, a physical blow that stole his breath. The fog swallowed the cottage whole, turning the world into a featureless gray maw. He could barely see his hand in front of his face. But the path to the remote monastery, etched into his mind from the journal's map, felt almost magnetic. He stepped out, into the maelstrom, the crashing waves now sounding like monstrous jaws snapping shut. It knew what he intended, and it would not surrender its prize easily. Dean pressed on, one determined foot after another, the locket clutched in his hand. The remote monastery. The last stand. A low groan emanated from the very structure of the lighthouse, not the familiar creak of old timber in a gale, but a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the stone, up through the soles of his boots. The lamp's beam, usually so steady, flickered, casting erratic, dancing shadows that stretched and warped the familiar space. He clutched the journal, his knuckles white. This was it. The precipice. The ancient pact. Only there, with the truest measure. The words blurred, then sharpened, coalescing into a horrifying clarity. He understood. The lighthouse was a focus, a beacon. But the true crucible, the site of the original binding, lay elsewhere. A place his grandfather had visited. A place steeped in the forgotten devotion of men who sought to contain what they could not comprehend. A remote monastery. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, staggering him. He hadn't just inherited a cottage. He had inherited a duty, a burden. Now, the lighthouse shuddered violently, glass panes rattling in their frames. A guttural sound, like stones grinding together beneath immense pressure, echoed from below. The entity was coming. It was here. He reached the base of the tower, the heavy oak door to the outside straining against its frame. He threw it open, the gust of wind almost tearing it from his grasp. The fog outside had thickened into an impenetrable shroud, swirling with an unnatural luminescence. He ran, blindly at first, then with a frantic, focused purpose, toward the cliffs where the old path, rarely used, led inland. The path to the remote monastery. The squawking of gulls sounded like tormented cries, the roar of the sea like a hungry maw. He slipped on wet rock, tearing his trousers, but didn't stop. The pressure in his head intensified, his vision blurring at the edges. He felt watched, not just by a single pair of eyes, but by 1,000 unseen points of awareness, all focused on his frantic flight. The remote monastery. It stood on a desolate rise, its ancient stone walls crumbling, its bell tower a skeletal finger pointing to the leaden sky. No light shone from its windows, no warmth radiated from its forbidding facade. He pushed through a rotting wooden gate, its hinges shrieking like tortured metal. The courtyard was overgrown with tenacious weeds, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. He stepped inside. The interior was a cavern of gloom, the vast space barely illuminated by the faint, eerie glow filtering through the fog outside. Dean's breath hitched. In the center of what must have been the main chapel, where an altar once stood, was a circular stone slab. Carved into its surface were intricate, archaic symbols, glowing with the same unholy luminescence he'd seen in his grandfather's journal. The place of the pact. It wasn't a language, but a raw sensation of vast hunger, of endless patience, of profound, ancient power. He saw it then, in the center of the symbols, a small, shallow depression. A basin, and next to it, a single rusty iron stylus, its tip sharpened to a needlepoint. It was a sacrifice of essence, his own. It was manifesting. Here. He gripped the stylus, its cold metal a shock against his palm. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against his ribs. He looked at the depression, then at his own trembling hand. His grandfather had known. He had prepared for this. He had brought Dean here. With a gasping breath, Dean brought the stylus to his left palm. The pain was immediate, a searing white-hot line across his skin as he dragged the point, carving a deep, ragged cut. He pressed his bleeding palm into the stone basin, letting his life's essence flow into the ancient symbols. As his blood spread, the glowing carvings flared, pulsing with an intense, blinding light. The entire monastery groaned, stones cracking, dust raining down from the ceiling. Memories, fragments of joy and sorrow flickered through his mind, his identity blurring at the edges. This was the sacrifice. This was the measure. The shriek receded, replaced by a sound like a vast ancient door slamming shut, echoing through the fabric of reality itself. The monastery stood, silent and still, but something had changed. The air no longer hummed with malevolence. The ancient pact was sealed. At what cost he could not yet comprehend. His grandfather hadn't just kept the light, he had fed it, or rather fed that which the light held at bay. The pact wasn't about defiance, it was about surrender. A sacrifice not of blood, but of essence. He understood now. The whispers, the shifting shadows in his periphery, the creeping doubt about his own memories. They weren't just attacks on his sanity. They were probes, seeking the weakest point, the most vulnerable aspect of his self to claim. The entity didn't want his body. It wanted his identity. A guttural thrum vibrated through the stone tower, deeper than the foghorn, more insistent than the crashing waves. It was the deep song, amplified, no longer a distant echo but a resonant chord within his bones. Dean knew the time was upon him. He had to act or be consumed. His determination wasn't born of bravery, but of a desperate primal instinct for self-preservation, however fractured that self might become. He descended the spiral stairs, each step heavy, deliberate. The lighthouse's beam cut through the thick fog outside, a futile gesture against the encroaching vastness. He felt the pull, a magnetic, sickening draw towards the water. The entity wasn't just under the waves, it was in them, of them, a liquid consciousness reaching for him. He pushed open the heavy door at the base of the lighthouse, the salt-laden wind immediately assaulting him. The fog was a living thing tonight, swirling and coiling, obscuring the familiar path to the cottage. He could hear it now, a chorus of deep, mournful tones rising from the sea, each note a tendril reaching into his mind, seeking purchase. He clutched the journal, its worn leather a meager comfort. He walked to the edge of the cliff, the spray from the furious waves misting his face. Below, the water churned with an unnatural phosphorescence, a sickly green glow that pulsed in time with the deep song. He saw no monstrous form, no tentacles breaking the surface. But the presence was undeniable, immense, a pressure that threatened to crush his very consciousness. This was the reveal, the terrible truth his grandfather had tried to articulate in his fragmented entries. The entity didn't need to manifest physically to devour. It fed on the idea of self, on memories, on sanity, on the very fabric of perception. The pact wasn't a prison for the entity. It was a ritual of appeasement, a constant offering to keep its hunger sated and its full emergence at bay. His grandfather had given pieces of himself, until there was nothing left but a vacant shell, a mind adrift. Dean felt a sudden, profound understanding of the old man's slow descent into madness. He closed his eyes, the deep song swelling to an unbearable crescendo. He felt his memories flicker, like old photographs in a dying fire. He clenched his jaw. He wouldn't let it take everything. With a shuddering breath, he opened his eyes. He focused on the journal in his hand, on the rough texture of the cliff rock beneath his boots. He grasped onto the most concrete thing he knew, his identity as a cartographer, the lines, the measurements, the immutable truths of the earth. He wouldn't offer his self for consumption. He would offer a boundary. He tore a page from the journal, a blank one, mercifully, and using a broken piece of charcoal he found in his pocket, he began to sketch. Not a map of the island, not a chart of the depths, but a symbol. a complex, recursive pattern born from the deepest, most primal parts of his cartographer's mind, a sigil of containment, of order imposed upon chaos. He poured his focus, his remaining sanity, his very will into the lines, creating a mental and spiritual barrier. As he finished the last line, the deep song faltered, a discordant shriek tearing through the air. The phosphorescence in the water dimmed, then vanished. The entity hadn't been defeated, merely diverted. He hadn't given it his truest measure of self in the way it wanted. He had given it a cage, forged from his own fractured identity. The cost was immediate and terrible. A vast expanse of his memory was simply gone, a blank slate where vivid experiences once resided. Faces, names, entire conversations. Erased. His sense of who he was, once so clearly defined by his past, was now a fractured mosaic. He was a cartographer, yes, but of what? He stumbled away from the cliff edge, the journal falling from his numb fingers. He needed to leave. He found his way back to his small boat, navigating by instinct through the now thinning fog, the lighthouse beam a mocking finger pointing to his shattered reality. He eventually made landfall on the mainland, miles from any recognizable port. He walked, driven by an unnamed compulsion, until the familiar world seemed alien, distorted. Days bled into one another. He spoke to no one, his mind a constant echo chamber of the deep song's muted hum and the terrifying absence of his own past. He found himself, eventually, drawn to a place of ancient stone and quietude. A remote monastery nestled in a valley carved into the coastal hills. A cloaked figure, an elder of the community, opened the door, their face a tapestry of serene lines. They looked at Dean not with surprise, but with a profound, sorrowful understanding. He said nothing, for the words were gone, taken by the deep. And the future, stretching out before him like an unmapped sea, was terrifyingly, utterly unknown.